ISO 27018 in the cloud, what actually protects your data, and what doesn't. Disclaimer. This article is written for people without deep technical background in cloud security standards. If you're an expert, you'll find some concepts intentionally simplified for accessibility. Introduction. Here's a scenario you probably haven't thought about. You hand over your most sensitive documents, birth certificates, contracts, medical records, to a storage facility you've never visited. The owner promises nobody will touch them. But how do you verify that promise? And what happens if that facility quietly subcontracts to another warehouse without telling you? That's exactly what happens when your organization trusts personal data to a public cloud provider. Names, email addresses, identity documents, and medical histories all travel to servers you don't physically control. Enter ISO/IEC 27018, the standard that promises to protect that information. Sounds great, right? In this article, you'll learn what this standard actually protects, where its coverage ends, and what you need to verify before blindly trusting a certification badge. Because understanding a tool's limits is just as important as knowing its strengths. This matters more than ever right now. With cloud adoption accelerating across industries, organizations are delegating increasingly sensitive data to third parties. There's a documented case where a client assumed ISO 27018 covered their data transfers to the United States, and it covered none of that. That kind of confusion can get expensive fast. What is ISO 27018, exactly? Think of ISO 27018 as a best practices playbook, not a lock that installs itself. It's a code of practice published by the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC. Its goal: protecting personally identifiable information, PII, in public cloud environments. PII includes any data that can identify a specific person, names, emails, phone numbers, photos, biometric data, or IP addresses. Here's the first thing that changes everything: ISO 27018 isn't a standalone certification. You can't get ISO 27018 certified on its own. What actually happens is that a provider first obtains ISO 27001 certification, the Information Security Management System, ISMS, essentially the overall security framework, and within that audit, the auditor verifies the additional 27018 controls. If a provider shows you an ISO 27018 certificate, without having ISO 27001 as its foundation, that document has no real normative backing. Always ask for the ISO 27001 certificate and confirm whether 27018 controls are within the audit scope. The latest version is ISO/IEC 27018:2025, which adds approximately 25 specific controls for PII protection in the cloud. Why this standard matters now, and why it's not enough. The risk of ignoring data protection in the cloud isn't theoretical. Every time your organization uploads personal information to an external server, you're trusting that provider to deliver on their promises. Without a framework like ISO 27018, you don't even have a common language to define what you expect from them. But the real danger sits at the opposite end, believing the badge covers everything. ISO certification audits are sample-based assessments at a single point in time, they're not continuous monitoring. A provider can pass the audit on Tuesday and start cutting corners on Wednesday. This is what experts call the organizational placebo. The company displays the badge as proof of protection without implementing the operational controls that give it substance. Implementation costs vary significantly. For small companies that already hold ISO 27001, adding 27018 controls can run between $10,000 and $25,000 over 3 to 4 months. For large enterprises without prior certification, costs can reach $150,000 over 12 to 18 months. The 5 core commitments of the standard. ISO 27018 establishes 5 commitments that cloud providers must meet. But here's the catch: these are guiding principles that require specific contractual and operational implementation, not automatic guarantees. Think of them as the rules of the game, not the game already played. First is consent and limited purpose. The provider can't use your data for anything that isn't explicitly authorized. They should only process PII following the client's documented instructions. Sounds protective, right? There's a key nuance: the responsibility for obtaining valid consent from end users falls on you, not your cloud provider. If you didn't get that consent properly, the standard won't save you. Second is the prohibition of commercial use. Your data shouldn't be used for marketing, advertising, or data mining beyond the contracted service. This is interpreted as a natural consequence of the processor role, though it doesn't appear as an explicit mandatory requirement in the standard's text. It's a subtle but important distinction. Third is data return and deletion. There must be a clear policy for returning, transferring, and securely deleting personal information when the contract ends. As we'll see later, the technical reality makes this significantly more complicated than it sounds. Fourth is transparency. The provider must clearly communicate how they manage, process, and protect personal data. They must notify you before changing the geographic location of your data, something many organizations don't realize can happen without warning. And fifth is subcontractor disclosure. They must reveal the identity of subprocessors and inform you about their use before engagement, allowing you to object. The depth of this subprocessing chain isn't clearly defined in the standard, which leaves an operational gap you need to cover contractually. How the shared responsibility model works. To understand ISO 27018, you need to know three key roles. The controller decides the purposes of data processing, typically your organization. The processor handles data on behalf of the controller under contract, typically the cloud provider. And the subprocessor is a third party hired by the processor who also accesses the data. Here's the trap nobody talks about: many cloud providers act simultaneously as processors, for your data, and as controllers, for telemetry, billing, and service improvement. ISO 27018 applies to the processor role, but it doesn't resolve this duality. A provider can comply perfectly as a processor while using derived data as a controller, and the standard won't cover that gap. Among the technical controls the standard references are encryption in transit. Think of this as a sealed envelope protecting your data while it travels across the internet, using TLS 1.2 or higher with AES 256, encryption at rest with hardware security modules, HSM, and role-based access control, RBAC, like having different keys for different doors based on your job title. 5 essential best practices to actually protect yourself. Having the badge on your provider's website isn't enough. These practices help you verify that the protection is real and operational, not just cosmetic. First, demand a detailed data processing agreement, DPA, that reflects the standard's commitments. Without a specific contract, principles remain good intentions. Your DPA should include concrete deletion timelines, geographic restrictions, and incident notification mechanisms. Second, verify that technical controls are actually running in production, not just documented on paper. Ask for evidence of active encryption, PII access logs, and data segregation between tenants. If the provider can only show you documentation without operational evidence, that's a red flag. Third, assess whether your organization is pulling its weight. The shared responsibility model means you have obligations to managing who accesses what data, classifying information by sensitivity, and keeping security policies current. Major providers like Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and Amazon Web Services are already certified. The real question isn't whether they comply, it's whether your organization is meeting its own obligations. Fourth, don't assume automatic regulatory compliance. ISO 27018 doesn't equal GDPR, CCPA, or any specific legislation compliance. You need additional legal mechanisms such as standard contractual clauses for international data transfers. Fifth, implement continuous oversight. Certification audits are snapshots of a specific moment, not a continuous recording of operations. A quarterly compliance review is more valuable than blindly trusting an annual audit. The 3 most common mistakes, and how to avoid them. The first mistake is believing ISO 27018 is the gold standard of cloud privacy. That claim is marketing, not analysis. The standard is a complementary code that depends on real operational implementation. An organization that believes it has total protection lets its guard down, and that false confidence is exactly what enables breaches. The second mistake is assuming the standard covers GDPR compliance. Implementing ISO 27018 doesn't equal meeting specific regulations. International data transfers, legal bases for processing, and data subject rights require legal mechanisms that this standard simply doesn't provide. The third mistake is trusting secure data deletion without verifying it. Real deletion in distributed cloud architectures is extraordinarily complex. Data gets automatically replicated, indexed across multiple services, and archived in backups with 30 to 90-day retention periods. Without forensic audit tools, complete deletion is a trust-based promise, not a verifiable fact. On top of that, the concept of reasonable timeframe for deletion has no precise definition in the standard. Conclusion. Here's what we covered. ISO 27018 is a valuable code of practice that creates a common language for protecting personal data in the cloud, but it's not independently certifiable. It always requires ISO 27001 as its foundation. If your provider doesn't have that base certification, the 27018 badge has no real normative backing. The gap between the written standard and actual operations can be massive. Without running technical controls, detailed contracts, and continuous oversight, the badge becomes an organizational placebo that generates false confidence. Your organization has its own responsibilities under the shared model, and no provider badge covers those for you. Access management, data classification, and specific regulatory compliance are your territory. The standard delivers real value when you understand it for what it is, one tool within a broader protection ecosystem. Combined with ISO 27701 for privacy management, with 60 to 70% control reuse, or SOC2 for the US market, with approximately 70% overlap with ISO 27001, it forms part of a solid strategy. Investment can range from $10,000 for small certified organizations to over $150,000 for complete implementations. But on its own, it doesn't solve the complete equation. Your first step. Review your cloud provider contract today. Check whether a detailed DPA exists, whether 27018 controls are within the audit scope, and whether your organization is meeting its own obligations. Start with what you can control. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether your provider has the badge. The question is, what's behind it? If you found this helpful, consider supporting my work. PayPal.me/VecConsultor. ko-fi.com/LuisOspina21292. PayPal, losospinaco@gmail.com. Or reach out for professional consulting. info@vvc-consultor.com.